Alrighty. So today's video, the idea was to talk a little bit about reinfection and the fears that people have around reinfection or any other kind of health fears, right? I try to make these videos as broad as possible because often if I'm talking about like fear of reinfection with long COVID, the content that I'm talking about, the approaches that I'm talking about are super valuable for anybody on the awakening path or the healing path that has some fear around their chronic illness or around something like that, right? A reinfection of any sorts, a fear of health of any sorts. So I want to start off by making that statement that, don't I feel like I'm saying this in every video, but because I consistently get these questions. Don't let your mind trick you into thinking that what I'm saying cannot apply to you. If it resonates, if it sounds applicable, then don't let some silly little label kind of become a block as to why you can't resonate with this content. So what I mean is like when somebody's like, oh, but you talk about long COVID and you talk about chronic fatigue syndrome, or you talk about awakening and you talk about non-duality, but does this apply to me with X, Y, Z? Yes. Okay. I'm not saying that I'm like I can heal anybody with whatever they're dealing with. What I'm trying to say is that just don't let your mind exclude you, because that's what the mind does. It wants to be separate. It wants to find reasons why this doesn't apply to it. So you trust your intuition, trust your kind of, that's all that this content is about, is providing you with things that arise from my viewpoint that you can integrate into your path, not about me telling you what to do or what not to do. So that's like my usual intro disclaimer, bloody, bloody, blah, that kind of shit. So to get into the juicy stuff now, what do I have to say about the fears that people have within themselves around reinfection, around health? So the reason this idea came to mind is because I'm a bit sick the last few days, and it's such a different experience than it ever was in the past. And it just felt like a cool time the idea came to mind of talking about this, because I get this question a lot. Different people in different, I've answered it in live streams, I've answered it here, there, but I have gotten questions around this kind of fear a lot. So yeah, here we are to talk about it. So, just to talk from my experience, I did, looking back in the story of the chronic illness when that was playing out for me, early on, there was massive fears of reinfection. The thing is, you have to start to see what your mind is always trying to redirect your attention away from feeling something you don't want to feel, right? So when there's deep-rooted fears coming up in your nervous system and in your experience, you are going to get fixated on the story around the fears, if that makes sense, right? So you are always going to be looking outwardly. You're going to be looking at, well, I'm experiencing fear, and that is because of this object or this experience that might happen in my life that can mess up this or that, right? That's what it comes down to. You want to start looking back at what is that thought referring to, right? So when you're having the thought like, wow, I'm very afraid of getting reinfected with COVID because this is going to lead to me having worse symptoms and it's going to lead me into a worse state. If you can follow that train backwards, what you will find is you are afraid of experiencing something now, right? It's not about this kind of drawn out timeline of the future and where it's going to take you. It looks like that in the mind, but the mind is trying to redirect your attention. What you want to do is you want to come back into, you want to trace that back into what am I afraid of, right? And not what am I afraid of as a story, because you could do this. You could say, what am I afraid of? And then the mind could come up with all sorts of answers. I'm afraid of getting reinfected, but just keep getting to the root, right? Get to the root. And the root is, it was interesting, this came up in one of the community meetings we had on Friday, talking about the fear of physical death. And that is one of the roots, right? Once you see that we're terrified of because there's identification with the body, there's identification with the physical form. This is why I talk about awakening as well, because for me, in the approach that I take, I can't leave that out. For me, it was the two unfolded simultaneously. So you want to, but it can play out quite nicely, right? So you want to just keep coming back into allowing yourself to feel the fear. That's what it is. It's not about getting away from anything. That's the beautiful thing, right? So when there's something triggering your fear, our initial perspective is that fear is bad. Fear is what got me into this state. And it's a tricky one to talk about because it's the relationship with fear that is bad. It's not the fear itself, right? Once you learn that I can experience fear, and I can actually allow myself to experience fear, and I can give love to the feeling of fear, and I can allow the part of me that's afraid to be there. But it's very different from fear becoming your worldview. And the funny thing with fear, right? Again, when I start to talk about fear, a lot of times this triggers people, and they're like, no, I can't feel fear because, like I just explained, fear is what got me into this. Fear is bad. But it's actually the repression, it's the fear of fear that makes us entering into these crazy kind of fear-based mindsets, because we're not allowing fear to pass through the system, if that makes sense. You're not allowing ourselves to feel fear as an experience. Instead, what we're doing is we get caught up in the reflection in the mind of fear. Right? So fear comes up, and then the mind has its reflection of what this fear means. And we get caught up in that world. We get caught up in the story, and we see that as the only world, right? We see that whatever the mind is saying is true, and all of these stories about fear, that's going to happen to me. And then it's overwhelming. It's terrifying. And then we start to live from that place. We start to behaviorally do things from that space. So once we learn that it's okay to feel fear, but you have to be willing to let go. You have to be willing to experience what is beneath this, right? Like I was just talking about the fear of physical death, it's also the fear of not being in control. That's what fear is primarily about, if we think about it. It's like, I'm afraid of this and this and this happening because I would no longer be in control of my life. I would no longer be in control of my physical experience. The mind lives in a space of control and fear of being out of control. So let's bring this back to a little bit more of a practical example where I started this about chronic illness or about reinfection, maybe with long COVID or any other chronic illness. When does that go away? Well, it goes away not through anything it can go away through the actual reinfection itself happening, because what happens is it breaks down this kind of terrifying other potential thing, again, that the mind is imagining this worst case scenario. And then all of these kind of worst case fears that we have, often the best way to break that down is to have the experience itself, to see that it was never about what the mind was saying it was about. It was about this kind of unconscious fear in the system, and then the mind projects that onto all of these scenarios, or there's specific scenarios that will be the triggers for us, right? So for different people, it will be different, but it's seeing it like that. So, for me, it kind of went away with the awakening work, with the deep kind of allowance, the deep feeling, the deep letting go, the breaking down identity, breaking down all, and this isn't complicated, right? This is just ways of talking about it, but it just comes through disidentifying with thought and then feeling what's underneath that, because that's the two steps, right? We stay up in thought to not feel the rawness of the emotion or the sensation. So once you do that, then something happens. You'd be like, okay, you realize that, okay, it's not about the reinfection itself. And then you get sick, or could play out the other way around. You get sick again. And then for some people, it is very intense, but it happens, right? It happens. And now it's no longer something that's in the rear view mirror, or like this potential for horrific experience. It's really like, to bring it back to awakening, when you have these massive kind of life brings you to your knees, and you have no choice but to truly surrender that you are not able to control experience, then that fear it releases through feeling the fear. You have to feel the fear. There's no getting away from it, right? So just go into it. And then this kind of root fear that was at all of these different scenarios just dissolves. It might come back, because then that means there's just more fear to feel. Nothing can go wrong, right? So if the fear comes back, the mind's interpretation is, oh, no, now I'm back here, XYZ. But yeah, it releases through these kind of experiences, really hitting rock bottom. And maybe sometimes that means your chronic illness needs to get worse, and it will bring you to your knees. And then at the same time, this doesn't mean that you can't take action to do things that are helpful for you, right? I'm always feel like I'm walking the fine line between saying, and this is why I always say, go back to your intuition, go back to your path, take what's useful, drop what's not useful, and be willing to try things for yourself. But yeah, for me, the experience now, so I go on all these wild tangents here. So good luck to anybody watching the videos. I hope that you're able to keep up with me. The experience now of, I mean, it's so difficult to talk about, right? Because once you go through the deeper stages of awakening, the whole story, the whole timeline is just experienced so differently. But we can still talk about it, right? So the experience of being sick now is just, everything just becomes a kind of fascination of experience, right? There can still be like, less pleasant physical sensations, but it's just an opportunity to explore it, right? So like maybe the nervous system will be more run down, so then I'll just sit and meditate. And all of those unpleasant experiences, the more I go into them, they become quite, as the distance from the experience dissolves, it becomes quite a pleasant experience. But when there's distance, like when you're busy and then all of this uncomfortable stuff is coming up, it can feel very intense because you're trying to hold distance from it. And then for me, these periods of being sick become just like an opportunity to experience things in a different way, because you're not resisting life anymore. You don't believe that you have a way that life should be and now it's gone wrong. You're just like, oh, this is what's happening now, right? Now I'm sick. But on the human level, you can still be like, oh, okay, I'm sick. Cool. I can take something that will make me less sick if you want to. Like, I like eating healthy foods. I like drinking these really cool raw juices and those kind of things to keep my body healthy. But then when you do get sick, then you experience it like that, right? And there's no way that it's not. But I'm just trying to point out how you can suffer less, right? So you can do whatever you want when you're sick. But if you're caught up in these stories of the worst possible thing is going to happen if this happens or if that happens, that's what I'm trying to point you out of. You can get sick, you can take pills, you can take painkillers, you can take whatever you want. But yeah, just from my experience now, when these kind of viruses happen or whatever, there's just an interest. But this is not like, wow, something cool that I've done to like make myself experience it this way. I mean, maybe all of the work I did in the past was helpful, but it was through the releasing of the core fears, through getting in touch with the core repressed material. That's the shadow work. You can watch my other videos about that. That then this overarching fear of life, because you feel like you're a separate identity navigating the world, that dissolves, and then along with it, the fear of anything going wrong, if that makes sense. And then if that hasn't dissolved yet, then we will still get triggered by fear of the physical, right? So that's the funny thing that happens, where people can have an awakening and then they'll have a chronic illness, and it will show them that there were still fears around the physical, physical experience, identity in the physical, that needed to be brought to light. And that's why the illness or whatever it is is actually life deepening the awakening process for you. Other people, it plays out the other way around, right? Like you get the illness first, and that leads you into the awakening process because you come into touch with all of these realizations and all of this deep suffering, and then that pushes you into ways to alleviate your suffering, and then you can have all of this kind of stuff. That's how it played out for me. So yeah, I mean, that was a bit of this, a bit of that, but maybe it's helpful. Hopefully it's helpful. Usually, it's funny, someone told me the other day to stop saying that because, but the funny thing is for me, I never, I've started to realize that most of the times it's helpful for somebody what I'm sharing, but it is funny. It just often feels like I'm saying this, saying that, and who knows how it's going to land for somebody, right? Could sound like a load of gobbledygook. So, yeah, good luck and all the best.